Hey YouTube, this is Jonathan, and I'm back with another Sicilian E4 or E5 push. In the Caruana game that we just looked at in my last video, we saw that Black opted to not take on E5, partially because he was going to get no pressure against the E5 square. So this time we're going to look at a game where, because of the configuration that white sets up, black is going to be able to get tremendous pressure against e5 and almost immediately win the pawn. Another key objective that we want to consider when we're looking at this game is that after the e5 push, often the black pieces are going to be able to create significant threats against the king side for the white king. And the reason for that is that after e4 has been pushed, there's commonly a bishop here on b7, which is going to be open. And then, since black usually when he's playing for e5 doesn't put a bishop here on e3, then this bishop, after a capture, because there's no longer going to be a pawn on d6, is going to have this diagonal as well to work on. So the power of these two bishops are going to be able to create significant threats, especially if white leaves his king here on the g1 square, which we're going to see both of these motifs playing in this game. So we get e4, c5, again, just the standard Sicilian con that we've been looking at all along. So after we get d6 and then f4 and knight bd7. So knight bd7, bishop e7, and b5 are all perfectly common moves in this situation here. So we get knight f3, which is a bit of an odd move. Presumably, his idea is that he wants to use the knight here to capture the. Excuse me. He wants to use the knight to capture excuse me, not capture, but defend the e5 square. But the knight on f3 is kind of in the way a little bit. It means that this queen is not going to be able to come out to this diagonal. It means that this rook is not going to be able to lift. So the knight on f3 tends to actually be a little bit awkwardly placed. So far more common is to play king h1. However, white decides he wants to try to do without this king h1 move, and he's going to pay for it. So b5, and then queen e1, which makes some sense since he's not going to be able to use this diagonal. He's going to try to come out through here, but he's also supporting this e5 push from here. So we get bishop b7, and then bishop d2, and now after bishop e7, white is already going to try to push for push for e5. This is pretty early, especially since black has control of this g4 square. So notice he hasn't committed yet his knight up to c5, which means he already has a pawn, a knight, and a queen against e5. And after this knight g4, he's going to have four pieces that are all going to be hitting this e5 square, which, if you're counting, white only has one, two, three. So four typically beats three as in most situations. The other thing is I notice is this diagonal is open. White should have really taken the time to play this king h1 move, but alas, he did not and played e5 immediately. So after e5, here black just captures. So after captures, the pawn takes, and he goes knight g4, which is immediately going to hit this pawn. It's really undefensible. For example, if white tries to play bishop f4, holding onto this pawn, well, we just capture here. And after the rook captures back, we're going to capture here, and forcing the rook back. And this pin, not very dangerous, especially since this king is on g1. If push comes to shove, we can always just play, for example, queen to c5, check, and then our knight is no longer pinned. Or if he plays something like h3, we can just play knight takes d3 because we're hitting the queen here. So Again, we're not afraid of this pen really at all. And you just picked up a clean pawn with good development, and yeah, this is not looking too happy for white already. So there's just no way for him to hold the pawn. So instead, he tries to do it tactically with bishop to e4. His idea now is I'm gonna capture. If you capture here, I'll capture back, and eventually you may have to use your queen, which is going to leave this bishop undefended. But we'll see tactically this is a flawed plan. It doesn't work at all. So just knight captures anyway, and after the knight takes, we're going to be able to capture back with our knight. Instead, if he were to try to play, instead of capturing back immediately, if he tries to play bishop takes b7, which is hoping that we'll take back with the queen and then you capture, and that's not very good for us. But instead, we just play knight takes f3, and note that this bishop cannot come back and capture because of mate with the queen here on h2. So you'd be forced to take with the rook, and then we could actually you can't even take with yeah you can take with the rook. So yeah, after rook takes, we don't even have to capture the bishop immediately. Actually, we can just play bishop to e3, which, excuse me, is really going to force him to play. We'll probably have to play bishop e3 because if he plays king f1, this is even worse. Again, king h1 not possible because of mate. He can just we're just going to capture here, and after king e2, then we'll capture here, and we're up 2 pawns. And this king isn't really winning any awards for his for the castle he's built for himself here. Kind of shaky situation. So clearly this his idea of trying to capture on b7 to try to defend his e5 pawn tactically is not going to work for him. So instead he captures here on e5, just thinking that he's going to draw the queen in to the e5 square. And now he plays rook f4, which is trying to deal with this threat here on the h2 square. G3, just ugly. It leaves the king much too exposed, especially with this bishop here that's just raking across the board. Again, if he tries to play like bishop f4, we see how useful this square and this square are to deal with any problems that he's going to have here. So again, of course, play rook f4, and then and then he plays bishop takes e4, which is nice because now this bishop's unopposed. Um, White could and perhaps maybe should capture this pawn, but after h5, he's threatening to play now g5, kicking this rook out of the way, allowing some attacks here. After h3 and then say just knight f6, maybe going to capture, and we capture here. And there are no complications on the board. Everything's quite simplified, and he's going to play c3 here. And black is just much better. He has a clean, safe extra pawn. He can just castle, put his rooks on the board, and have in the center of the board, and have a nice, clean, comfortable advantage. So white really wanted to, instead of try to suffer in a long endgame, decided to try to keep things a little bit more complicated, and instead he plays rook takes g4, which I suppose he felt that knight with the queen here, that combination was just intolerable. Plus, he's maybe going to get some pressure against g2. The black king is still in the center, so he maybe has some hopes he's going to pull something off here. But after f5, which defends this bishop and hits the rook, um, white tries to play bishop to f4. But again, we're going to see how useful this diagonal is now. Just because he's able to deal with this, get out of the way with check. Bishop e3, which black has the option. He can just go back and be comfortable with a draw. I mean, he did start out as a black side, so of course draw isn't a terrible result. But instead, he decides he wants to play for the win, and he plays queen c4, which means he's not defending this g7 pawn anymore. But black reckons that if this g file comes open, there's a good chance that he's going to be able to gain control of this g file. And when you pair the g file with this bishop here, and then the active queen, which will be able to probably rejoin the diagonal, if anything, just by c6. He's going to develop a lot of pressure here. But anyway, black goes for the pawn, just trying to equalize the material. Bishop f6, just trying to kick the rook off of this diagonal immediately. Notice that he really doesn't have very many squares if he wants to stay on the diagonal. He really only has g3. Which I think he probably should have played rook g3. Now, if he does choose this, black can just convert his bishop pair into a long-term structural weakness for the white camp. Of course, he's going to take back with the pawn. Taking back with the queen just means we're going to trade queens, and these pawns are going to be even weaker with less material on the board. Black's king still being somewhat in the middle, he's going to want to keep the queen on to try to get some activity against it. But after just castles here, again, black is pretty comfortable. White has a lot of weaknesses. This pawn is weak. This pawn is weak, as is this one as well. So it's, again, this would be quite a tedious defensive task. It's not really clear that White is going to be able to come up with much in the way of counterplay. So he wanted to avoid this option, and instead he plays. Oops, I went too far back. Instead, after here, he plays not rook g3. Not rook g3. He plays knight takes e4. Again, deciding that he thinks this bishop is just too powerful to leave on the board. So black goes in and takes the knight, maintaining some pressure here, and excuse me. Also, now he's gonna go. White. He's threatening to take this pawn here. So now, even if we play g3. Rook to g3, we even have just this move with no, I guess we don't quite have this move. Yeah, we do, because we'll just, after takes here, he can come take this pawn. That's starting to look pretty scary, so maybe that's not so hot. But instead he plays rook c7, trying to defend this pawn. But that's going to give black a tempo, because he's going to play here, activating this bishop to a more useful square, and kicking this white rook out of the camp. Probably best was to come here and just try to swap rooks, because the rook ends up getting in some trouble here. It only has one square along this diagonal, along this rank. Notice how the queen and when the bishop was here, plus this bishop here, on these two central squares, really just control lots of the board, especially these two advanced pawns, really taking away a couple of key squares as well. It's really tough for White to really be able to work with his pieces, because he really has no central control whatsoever. So he plays rook c5, and now rook g8, with an obvious mating threat here. White is really under tremendous pressure, and he blunders here quite badly. But queen f2 is the only move that he has that doesn't immediately lose lots and lots of material. And even this move is going to drop the exchange. So White would just have to deal with this f4 push. And after a capture here, we get just this move. And he's going to have to drop an exchange at the very least here. Or sorry, not after. He's not going to take here. That's even worse, because he's going to lose the rook. He has to play this move. And then now, after we capture here and here, black doesn't have much in the way of threats anymore. I mean, he does have this exchange, but he's going to have a little bit of trouble coordinating. His king is pretty exposed. So it would... White has some chances to hold on here. But instead of this move, he chose to play queen e2, which is understandable. I mean, just on principle, I can see why you wouldn't want to line your queen and king up when there's some possibilities of a bishop coming to this diagonal, especially with the rook lined up on it. So I can see why you wouldn't want to do that on principle, and perhaps you just miscalculated. But after queen e2, just bishop to d4, taking advantage of the fact that the queen is now undefended. He's threatening to just lop this bishop off or take here with check and then take here. He's dropping all kinds of material. The best he can really do is to play like this. After we capture, after he captures here, he's going to take back. We get this capture. He's forced to take here, and then after we take here, he's up. He wins an exchange plus an additional pawn, and this is just really strong. White's going to have to come back here, and he can even just trade queens, and I'm sure that this rook plus these two pawns are going to easily outplay the bishop and the queen. So this would just be awful, but honestly, it's the best he's got after queen e2. Instead, White chose to play queen h5, and this is just way worse. Just rook g6, blocking the check, and after the queen now comes back to defend the mate threat, so the queen comes back, we're just going to capture here, and then you move, and then we could just capture here. And sure, you can double my nice pawns, but I'm up a rook and a bishop, so far more than enough material, which is why after rook g6 here, White just resigned. So quite a nice and instructive game, really showing the attacking possibilities that Black has against the White king if White isn't careful to safeguard his king and allows use of this g4 square, giving Black just tremendous pressure against e5. Once e5 fell, there was no stronghold for an attack on the king side. Hadn't even castled yet, so he could have always gone the opposite way if White was able to generate anything, but he just wasn't, because he was too busy trying to defend the e-pawn, which that failed, and then after the e-pawn fell, he was too busy trying to defend his own king, and just was never able to exert any real pressure against the black position. Anyway, I hope that you found this game instructive and entertaining as well. Make sure to leave me a comment, and I'll see you guys on YouTube. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.